going to introduce you to Dr. Rebeca López-García because she is going to be the moderator of the first session of the day, which refers to safety, regulation, and assessment of sweetener intake of LNCSs in Latin America. Dr. Rebeca López-García studied chemistry at the La Salle University in Mexico, and she holds a certificate of food chemistry by the State University of Michigan. She studied her PhD in food technology and toxicology by the State University of Louisiana, and she is a current chair of the Laggard Food Science Consulting, which offers consulting efforts in food safety, toxicology, and food regulation for over the past 25 years. He has worked with international organizations like the USAID, the several United States organizations, and the FAO at the UN. And she has also participated in numerous projects for over 30 years. So I'm going to give now the floor to Dr. Rebeca. She is going to participate as a coordinator for this new session. So thank you all for your attention and presence.
¿Se escucha?
Okay, do you copy?
Muy buenos días.
Good morning. It is truly an honor for me to be here in this beautiful city of Mérida. Good morning, America, and good afternoon, Europe. It is truly an honor to join you as part of this panel of experts. I'm truly at awe to see the amount of people that are now online. First off, I want to introduce my co-moderator, Marizela López Cattebeke, who is going to be coordinating this session alongside myself. So that we can start. Today we're going to talk about the updating on the safety assessment for LNCSs by global regulatory agencies, and specifically the organizations that do the risk assessment that allows for these regulatory agencies to make risky decisions. Of course, these are my conflict of interest. As Dr. Hill pointed out, I participated as a consultancy expert and have worked in the approval of practically pretty much all of the materials that we're going to talk about. I am part of a scientific council of several different companies, and all of the information that I'm going to share with you is based on what has been published by international organizations all over. So why should we begin with these evaluations and this matters in safety? Well, that's because it is important to set the basis for safety. And what does safety even mean? Because perhaps this is one of the topics that, although we point out that most of these chemical elements tend to be labeled as safe, they're always questioned as not being safe. So for me, it is important to point out not only the process of assessment and evaluation, let it be very clear that sometimes when you bring in a new chemical into the market, the assessment continues. This is a dynamic, continuous effort that happens in consumption patterns, and we can see these changes all over the place, especially when people go from a plant-based diet or other types of regimens like being vegetarians or vegans. These individuals change their consumption patterns as well. So the regulatory agencies and the risk assessment agencies need to ask themselves and evaluate how the public is exposed to these chemicals, and if all the approval decisions are to be kept, that is, approval and entry into the market are not the end point. And the processes of assessment from the agencies that we're going to mention, which are the international agencies of reference, they can be programmed as it happens in Europe or as a direct response or a specific event like other agencies. It is important to clarify that these risk groups are composed of independent experts that are free of a conflict of interest, and they take into account all of the available information when they do their evaluations. The toxicological evaluation or assessment from these agencies feeds the regulatory agencies in an international level so that we can make decisions for risk management. And we take into account any potential effect or what we might call an adverse effect. And we need to think as to what is an adverse effect and why when the WHO says that something is safe, they take into account the entirety of the toxicological information available. An adverse effect indicates an ample variety of biological uh, outcomes that can affect the health and well-being of the exposed organisms. This outcome can be observed as a great number of modifications of the homeostatic equilibrium at different levels of complexity. That means that we do not evaluate only in this context what we would consider the classic toxicology, acute toxicology, carcinogenicity, we evaluate any other type of impact that it could have on the health. That, of course, includes, in the case of sweeteners of LNCSs, the impact of glucose metabolism, the responses to different expositions, the effect and impact of microbiota. What does the WHO define as an adverse effect? Which is a morphological change in physiology, growth, that is children, development, again children, life expectancy of an organism that would result in an alteration in the functional capability or the capability to compensate additional stress or increase the susceptibility of negative effects of other environmental influences. That means that when the WHO says that a product is safe, not only do they take into account the classic toxicity of animal models, but they also take into account any physiological impact that may be considered as an adverse effect. The regulatory agencies at a global level based their risk decisions regarding the risk assessments given by other agencies at an international level. They take into account the opinions of the JECFA, the FDA, and the AFSA, and all of these agencies do independent evaluations. And when the three coincide, truly the body of evidence is of a much worth because they all have a processes that follow the scientific process in itself, but they do so independently. The JECFA evaluates all of the LNCS is motivated by observations that come from continuous surveillance. And they, once a chemical goes into evaluation, or there are publications that question any adverse potential effect, it becomes part of their official agenda. And once it is part of the official agenda for the JECFA, they follow their normal evaluation or assessment process and the rigorous evaluation of the entirety of the information. The FDA has no program to process. What they do is they reevaluate, motivated by observations of continuous surveillance. And the EFSA established that any product that was approved before 2009 needs to be reevaluated before 2027. So the EFSA has done a lot of work in reevaluating most of the products that were released. Also, it is very important to take into account that these three agencies are the ones for reference in food security. And it is also important to make a difference between the IARC, which is a WHO organization, and the JECFA, which is a expert committee. Why are they different? The IARC evaluates dangers, and that means anything that could create has a potential of creating an adverse effect against health. Only dangers. They do not directly evaluate foods or foodstuff in general or other consumption habits. They only say from a universe of chemical elements all over the world, there are a few that we need to evaluate to see their potential in carcinogenicity, which means that they evaluate work exposition, respiratory exposition, cutaneous exposition without labeling or truly pondering upon exposition itself. They only say that things need to be observed because of these other things. And this is an important because they have emitted an opinion on aspartame based on some of observation studies in which they said we need to evaluate. The JCFA does evaluate, however. They do evaluate the risk. And what does risk mean? It means the probability of a potential adverse effect can actually end up happening. So the reference agency for food stuff is the JECFA. They only focus on food itself and orally ingested food, that is, and they evaluate normal doses and conditions of intake that take into account the route of exposition, which is orally, the dosage, the frequency, and the moment of life, and which is an important aspect if we think, for instance, the stages of life, like the infancy, childhood, and pregnancy. Because they have a programmed evaluation, I'm going to stop a little bit on the EFSA because they have established this mechanism that you see here. All of the products that become part of a market before 2009 need to be evaluated, and they've generated a lot of information about that. These evaluations take into account real exposition or exposure. They take into account that there's an exposure by the population, and they take into account human-born studies. The previous evaluations did not take into account human studies, and these do so. And when we think about assessing any type of adverse potential, they also evaluate if there's a dosage response adverse effect as well. They do an extensive revision of the literature. They call upon the public to provide more information. They evaluate the studies to determine the relevance of said studies. They evaluate bias as well. And through the weight of evidence method, they ponder upon the body of evidence to make a decision and determine if the levels at which they were previously declared to be safe can be kept as so due to this body of evidence that they come up with. What are the questions that are the most common in taking into account with these evaluations? We can see them answered. Well, the first one is very relevant, which is the metabolic excretion and absorption measure for the specific chemical. And this is very important because excretion is incredibly relevant. There are many articles that report or say that they might not be inert, but when they report that they are not inert, it is associated to an adverse effect. But they are not inert because they interact with the sweet flavor receptors, and those that are excreted through the urine, they go through the liver, they activate the cytochromes that make it possible so that they can become metabolized and more soluble, and they can be excreted through the urine. So when an article reports that a cytochrome was activated, that does not mean it is an indicator of a potential adverse effect. When they do reevaluation, however, there's a lot of information on human data, and they can be compared in terms of absorption, distribution, metabolism, and expression between animals and humans. In this new assessment, the EFSA had focused on the evaluation of genotoxicity as an exclusive endpoint. Genotoxicity can be related to cancer, but they also said that other than carcinogenicity studies, they need to know if there might be any other and potential indicator that they could cause genetic damage and therefore have an adverse outcome. And this evaluation, the organization has after all of the screenings for genotoxicity, and they take into account also all of the clinical studies and observational and intervention studies in human beings, and they assess whether there's a relationship between the doses and exposure between amongst all of the adverse events. And at the end, what would be the potential of mode of action? And this is an important aspect because there are many observations and narrative studies that point out that there can be an association, but there's no mechanism of explanation. So we take into account sometimes the impact or effect on chemical messengers. If we talk about absorption, for instance, metabolism and excretion of specific pathways, and also the potential of adverse effect that has been reported, and it does not coincide with these metabolic routes, there might be an impact perhaps on the messengers, the chemical messengers, or many other, or perhaps on other mechanisms to be reported as adverse effects. And this is how we reach the publications in the evaluations. The first one is aspartame, that was evaluated in 2013, and then in 2023 by the GECFA. And what were the conclusions? They confirmed that it is a safe chemical. There's an absence of potential adverse effects. That, of course, includes studies and clinical behavior studies as well. They take into account genotoxicity, and they consider the daily intake of 40 milligrams per kilo. And they remind us that this is designed to take into account all of the vulnerable subgroups. That includes, of course, children. In 2023, the FDA, against the publication of the IIRC, in which they declared the aspartame as potential cancer-borne chemical, they maintained that it was safe, and they confirmed that the evidence points out that it is indeed safe. The essential frame K, they point out that it is a safe intake, including the genotoxicity questions. They increased the IDA for 9 milligrams per kilo. Erythritol, evaluated in 2023, safety has been confirmed, and also in terms of genotoxicity. There are potential laxative effects, however, and secondary effects associated with the laxative effect itself. The IDA is established based on the potential of the laxative effect by 0.5 grams per kilogram on a daily basis. Neotame, which was evaluated in 2025, safety was confirmed, including genotoxicity questions, and the IDA increased by 10 milligrams per kilogram a day, which is in alignment with the admissible IDA as reported by the GACFA. Saccharin and calcium and potassium salts, which was reevaluated in 2024, confirms safety again. That includes, of course, genotoxicity, which responds to many of the questions that could be associated with cancer. And they increased the IDA to 5 to 9 milligrams per kilo per day. Talmatine, which was evaluated in 2021, confirmed security, including genotoxicity, and they recommend adjustments to specifications in order to consider impurities and to limit impurities that might have been reported with a few questions beforehand. And they concluded that their safety profile requires no numeric IDA limit. Aspartame dihydrochalcone, which was evaluated in 2022, we confirmed security, including genotoxicity, and it is established in IDA by 20 milligrams per kilogram. The entirety of the list that you see on the screen, these are the sweeteners that are now being reevaluated. There's a few public calls upon to make sure that we can confirm the genotoxicity profile and complete the tests. We hope that these will be published at least in the next 2 years. And to conclude, the regulatory agencies have dynamic processes of surveillance and evaluation. When they alight into an approval and limits of approval, not only do they take into account toxicology in its traditional form, but they also take into account any potential adverse effect. The reassessment is more important, however, because it considers all the real exposure, presence in the market, and clinical human studies in which now they have become ethical. So they conclude on the validity of any other potential adverse effect in the use of the daily intake by taking into account the intervention and observation studies. It also considers a real exposure. We also need to remember that they are assessed on a case-by-case basis. When safety is confirmed, that implies exposure, real exposure, and all the potential adverse effects, which include microbiota, effects in glycemic control, and all of the potential adverse effects in such a way that when the WHO says that they are safe, there's no buts there. It is safe, truly, within, of course, the established regulatory limits. And with all that, I finish my presentation and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Rebecca, for this great introduction. Now we will have the keynote by Dr. Socolovsky, and we have another person who will be coordinating with Rebecca our first panel. So let me introduce Marizela López Cattebeke. She is a nutritionist, a specialist in non-transmissible diseases by the Paraguay University in Asunción. She's an expert in diabetes type 2 and bariatric surgery in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She also has a postgraduate in the River Plate soccer team, and currently she's in the regulatory agency in the general direction in the food industry in Dinavisa in Paraguay, as well in the general services in Mercosur, and also in the committee in Codex about special dietary regimes. Thank you, Marizela, for being here with us and for participating in the coordination of our panel. So you too can come up to the stage to continue our conversation for today. Hi, good morning. To continue with our program today, we would like to introduce Dr. Susana Socolovsky. Dr. Susana will be with us today. She's from Buenos Aires. She has over 35 years old in research, teaching, and food research as well. She came from UBA, the Buenos Aires University. She received the award in the organic chemistry in Argentina. She's a member of the ALFOX and also a certified scientific by the IFT. She has also been president from the ATA, and she's a specialist in the technological innovations and the development of ingredients in Latin America, especially with non-sweetened food, and she's also a representative of NGO and Codex, and she's an international speaker in over 280 events. Dr. Susana Socolovsky will be with us today, this morning. Thank you. Thank you so much for this introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. For everyone who organized this event. It's a pleasure to be here with us and to share information that has to do with the current situation in Latin America. So let me see. Okay, very good. So we are ready. So today we'll be talking about recent developments in the regulation of LNCS and policies in Latin America. I have no conflict of interest in this presentation because I do not work in public policies or related with Latin America government in the solution of public policies. However, there is a disclaimer because I am related as a technical consultant in scientific and regulatory matters, because my main job, just like Rebecca's, is the regulation of different ingredients that include LNCS in Latin America. So our agenda today will be talking about food guides in Latin America. We'll be talking about the impact of the NOVA classification in the food additives. We will see which are the front labels in Latin America, which of them have a warning for LNCS, and then we'll be talking about nutritional policies that come from these front labels. As you all know, in 2014, the dietary guideline for the Brazilian population was published. This added for the first time in Latin America a classification of NOVA food items that started to come around 2009, and it provided some nutritional recommendations such as limiting the consumption of processed foods, eating them in small quantities as ingredients of food dishes. This is a system that highlights home preparation of food. And it says for processed foods, the ingredients and techniques that we use in preparing them, like cheese, bread, vegetables, they negatively alter the composition of food that they come from. This is strange compared to what we have consumed in our past decades, but there is a new classification because it says that we need to avoid the consumption of ultra-processed foods, which is a concept that has been invented by the San Pablo University. But they will be like cookies, packaged snacks, soda, noodles, instant noodles. We will not be discussing how valid this is, but it is worth mentioning that there is no definition, just a great description and a list of foods that are considered ultra-processed. And here we have a great and big list where we can see the ingredients that we use in the kitchen and additives as well. Which was the problem here? And how was this classification extended in Latin America? This happened when the Pan American Health Organization published in 2015 a document that introduces the NOVA classification created by Dr. Carlos Monteiro in Brazil. This gave a category of foods based on their processing stage, and it concluded that the association between the annual sales per capita, ultra-processed foods, and an increase of BMI that they were directly related, but this has no validity. However, in February 18 in 2016, the OPS published a nutrient profile, and for the first time, this nutrient profile takes into account excess nutrients that do not match their percentage in the diet. It doesn't match the consumption goal for a 2,000 calorie diet. It highlights other the occurrence when they need to be highlighted in a front label. So, due to time restriction, we are not able to go through all of this, but take a look at this part of the document where it says, besides critical nutrients, other sweeteners, and look at the glossary because they are explained. We have LNCS that include different elements. They are included in this model. The regular consumption of sweet foods with or without sugar promotes the ingestion of sweet beverages and sweet foods, even if they do not contain sugar. This is very important, especially for children, because the consumption at an early age defines the habits throughout life. But we will see that this is not completely true. And the document provides two references, Sweeteners in 2015 and Menela in 2014. Later on, the next year, in 2016, we have the dietary guidelines for the Uruguayan people. And it says, avoid the consumption of ultra-processed food. And if we focus and make a close-up, we say to using sugar, fat, and several additives, we highlight the flavor of ultra-processed products, and this can induce a habit. So there is a wrong idea that using additives with the goal to create a habit in the consumption of this food. But it is the first time in this guideline that there is a long list of ingredients. We can see on this slide for each category, we can see a long list of ingredients that convert one food in an ultra-processed food, for example, here, and we can see it in beverages as well. This long list of interest of items also includes LNCS. So the group that invented the NOVA classification has published several papers where it says that industrial ingredients and food additives are markers of an ultra-processed food. This is a text. This is a practical way to identify an ultra-processed food is to see if the list of ingredients contains at least one characteristic element of the group. These are food substances that are never or rarely used in the kitchen, and we see the list here, or additives that are designed to make the final product more more appealing, such as sweeteners. So this is a marker of a food that should be avoided, and this is the contrast with the approval of food additives by Codex and assigning to each category of foods everything that they need to include. Also, let's remember that Codex defines food, and it also defines food additive, which is any substance that is used at any part of the process and that you can expect that these can be related directly or indirectly to affect the characteristics of the products. That is, that all food additives, including sweeteners, are approved by Codex and included in the categories where they are allowed to be used. This concept was extended to different countries like Peru, Ecuador, of course, Mexico. And recently, August 1st of this year, we have the dietary guideline for Colombian people based on biodiversity and real nurturing. So here we have concept of a true food speech generated by a Spanish person that you all know about. These are the consequences that we see when we say that processed foods need to be avoided. And there is a generation of public policies that created front labels, not on, not only they appeared in many countries, like in Chile in June 2016, but it started to grow and grow and grow. And we went to have some rounded seals like the ones we see in Israel and Colombia to the octagon one where it says it contains sweeteners. Then Mexico also had a warning that says it contains sweeteners not to be used in kids. Then Argentina copied these. Then in 2024, we also got Brazil and Paraguay implementing the labels with the magnifying glass, just as in Canada. And in 2025, we have this map where in Chile, we have a public consultation where they suggest using a warning that says it contains sweeteners, avoid consumption for kids. So these are the countries that agree on the limits of 100 milligrams. These are the countries that respond to the nutrient profile from OPS based on calories. For example, calories given by sugar. And these are the countries that have warnings about sweeteners, LNCS sweeteners. So let's see. Let's review. Ecuador had established a statement that says this product contains LNCS with no restriction, only a front label to let people know that this is present, but no relationship with kids' health. Then in 2020, Mexico started with the NOM 021, and it repeats the profile nutrient model. And now they have this in 2020, the same beverage in Mexico had two octagons, excess calories, excess sugar, as well as the warning for sweeteners. And in Chile, the same beverage had no labels in Chile. So this warning statement for about sweeteners applies to poly alcohols, which are considered a benefit in Europe. For example, the health claim, it says that it doesn't create cavities in teeth. So in some countries, they would need to have the warning, like in Argentina, in Mexico. Then in Argentina, they had the law 27.642, healthy eating, and it copies the Mexican norm. And it suffered some changes in 2024. And I will only show the changes related to sweeteners because they signal sweeteners and polyalcohol and the polyols that are used as they have no warnings anymore. Because there are, for example, foods like include sorbitol, and they do not have the warning or the label. Chile is the last case that we will review. In Chile, in 2016, there was a norm 2026, and over 1,700 products were reformulated to avoid the use of labels. And of course, the sugar changes were used to use sweeteners and polyols. In Chile, it is mandatory to have a table where you indicate the presence of LNCS. So the regular label already includes how many milligrams of sweeteners are present there. In 2022, 2023, and 2024, we had some research going on, and this was called FONIS. And this was created by INTA, and this was a specific research about sweeteners in foods in Chile. What you see here is just an explanation of the team who performed this research. There was no ADI analyzed. You will review this with Dr. Samuel Durán. But what we saw is a continuous use and prevalent use of sweeteners by pregnant women, teenagers, breastfeeding mothers, and children. And the use of sweeteners didn't represent a lower intake of sugar. So based on this prevalence research, the prevalence of sweeteners in Chile, they got to the conclusion that by having 39 professionals in this area, I'm sorry that my slide moved out, but they decided with 39 stakeholders that were asked many questions about how they needed to act. They said that it was useful to say that LNCS were present and to restrict marketing to these kind of products. Therefore, this measure was a response to the high intake of sweeteners in the Chilean market food industry. But as you will see later with Dr. Samuel Duran, this did not represent a risk in Chileans' people's health. So the warning was it contains LNCS, avoid consumption for kids. This is being reviewed by the legal side in Chile. We know that the label needs to be simplified, clear, and truthful information about the nutrients in the content of food. So these are not nutrients, so they should not be part of the front labels. To review the guidelines of Codex in 2021, we have some statements that need to be fulfilled. Countries are not fulfilling these. So therefore, we should not expect this kind of warnings in food. With this, I would only like to remind you that this has generated restrictions at the level in school canteens, and there isn't any food that have a front label can be consumed at schools. Of course, home prepared foods are allowed to be served in the canteen. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you, Susana. Thank you for this great journey around the world regarding front labels. With this, we will go to our next part, next segment, and we will talk about case studies according to the exposition, different parts of our region. Now we will have Dr. Georgina Salas. She's a professor in the biochemistry department in the University of Costa Rica. She's also a bachelor's degree in nutrition with a master's degree in biochemistry and a PhD from the University of Costa Rica. In the latest year, her research has been focused in the nutritional state and the assessment of the Latin American diet. Her contributions in this field were highly recognized with the Science Award in 2023. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here with you today in this forum about LNCS. And today I will be talking about the sugar consumption in Latin American countries, especially about the results of the ELANS research. I have no conflict of interest for this presentation. This is the Latin American research about nutrition and health that was performed between 2014 and 15. It's been almost 10 years. And it had a representative sample of several countries in Latin America, specifically 10 countries: Costa Rica, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil, Peru, Chile, and Argentina. We had a total participant number of 9,218 who were distributed as you see on this slide. The main goal was to assess the food consumption, physical activity, and obesity prevalence in these countries, because at that time, including Costa Rica, many of us, we didn't have updated information related to this matter. The sample was almost 50-50 men and women, and we divided these in 4 age groups: 15 to 19, 20 to 34, 35 to 49, and 50 to 65 years old. And also we analyzed several variables according to the socioeconomic level, measured through what we see here and according to each country. Then we have an evaluation about food consumption. These were one-to-one interviews. We went to people's home and we used the 24-hour remembrance following the 5-step method. And we tried to get people to remember what they had eaten the day before and to get as many details as possible of what they ate, where they ate, how they prepared them, and the characteristics, and especially the quantities. All of this was analyzed using these manuals, or if it was possible, we measured everything again. Once we had the grams, we analyzed it with the nutrition data system for research from the University of Minnesota. Now I will show you the results of added sugar consumption. It is worth mentioning that food has intrinsic levels of sugar, and now we will evaluate added sugar or free sugar that also includes syrups, honey, that naturally include sugar. Today we'll be talking about added sugar in the different processes when producing or consuming this food. So what we found, for the total sample, we had a consumption of 65.5 grams per day. And this was very different in the 10 countries where we saw that Argentina was the country with the highest consumption with 91.4 grams, and Chile, the one with the lowest consumption. Maybe grams are not as important, but we wanted to learn, well, this is the definition that I was telling you about: total sugar, added sugar, and free sugar. Total would be the some of all of them. But today we are talking about added sugars. So here we wanted to learn the percentage out of the total calorie amount. And we found that for the total sample, added sugar was 13.2% of the total calorie intake. And we see many differences where Argentina has the highest percentage. And you will see that this is above the recommendation from the WHO that says that we should not go over 10%. But the suggestion it is that it is lower than 5%. So we are all consuming a higher quantity that we should. If we see the differences between men and women, men consume less per gram, but that represents a lower percentage from the total number of calories because they have a higher intake. But when we analyze per age group, we see that people from 50 to 65 years old consume a lower percentage compared to the calorie intake. But these differences are not statistically significant. And the same happens when we analyze per socioeconomic levels. These percentages were very similar. Then we saw where these added sugars come from. For all countries, the main source were sodas, followed by coffee or tea, fruit juices, sugar itself, flavored milk, powder mixes for beverages, and juices that were ready to drink, cake, white bread, and cookies. We need to pay attention to some things here. Juice fruit, this is what you in Mexico call flavored waters. For us, they are called frescos. They are homemade. And together, juices and coffee and tea at the same percentage or a similar percentage to soda. And these percentages are different among countries. For example, in Argentina, sodas provide 36.5% of the total amount of calories. In Peru is less than 20%. In Costa Rica, this is 19.5%, but fruit juice and coffee and tea that are prepared at home, they have even a higher percentage than sodas. And as you can see here, beverages add up 75% of the calorie intake from added sugars. So we drink sugar. We don't eat it as much as we drink it. Now, if we make this comparison from the sources between men and women, men get a 32% ingestion of calories from sodas, and women do it less. And when we talk about age groups, people who are over 50 years old, they have a percentage of 20.8% of ingestion that comes from sodas instead of 28.4%. But coffee and tea provide 22.2%. When we talk about socioeconomic levels, there is no different. So those are the main source of added sugars. So to summarize, we see a high consumption of added sugars in the Latin American region that surpasses the WHO recommendation. We also see significant differences in added sugars among countries, but not in different genders, age groups, or socioeconomic levels. The main source of added sugars are sodas and beverages in general, regardless of the country, gender, age, or socioeconomic level. This highlights the need to make interventions to decrease the use of added sugars since we are surpassing the WHO recommendation and to continue to do some research to monitor the added sugar consumption. Our research was from 10 years ago, but we need to continue performing this kind of research. Thank you very much. And here you can see a QR code in case you would like to take a look about the ELANS study. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas gracias, doctora. Siguiendo un poco
con el cronograma. I'll continue with the program. I want to remind all of the people present here that at the end of the presentations, we're going to have a Q&A session and discussion panel. So please take notes of any of the questions that you might want to ask to our different speakers. Now we're going to introduce you to Dr. Samuel Durán Agüero. He is going to be the person in charge of talking about LNCS's intake in Chile.
Bueno, el doctor, un ratito ordeno mis papelitos acá. Ok. Bueno, el doctor Samuel Durán, él es nutricionista, egresado de la Universidad de Concepción en
Chile. The Concepción University in Chile. He has a master's in health promotion and bachelor's degree in nutrition and food service at the INTA University of Chile. He is the director of nutrition and food research at CLAM in Chile, former chair of the nutritionist school and faculty of Chile. He's the current director of Masters of Nutrition and Public Health at the San Sebastián de Chile University. His line of research is epidemiology, nutrition, and he has over 230 publications in several journals and 4 chapters in different books. He has been overseeing a few dissertations for PhD students and master's degree students. Dr. Durán, we thank you for your presence.
Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Thank you for the invitation. These are my conflicts of interest. I have done advisorship in several LNCSS-oriented companies in Chile. I'm going to skip this because we know exactly what we're talking about regarding excess in sweetener intake. This is all about excessive intake, not occasional intake. So Chile used to be second place in sugar intake and sixth in salt in 2016. We were actually competing with Argentina and Mexico in daily intake of sugary beverages. But our front label came in, our frontline labeling came in, and we were going to see whether it was effective or not. Actually, Susana already spoiled a little bit of the results. She promised she wouldn't spoil them, but she did anyway. Also, this is the sugar intake that Georgina showed, in which Chile has quite the elevated numbers, but it is still not the highest. Argentina was actually taking over us. However, thinking about 10% or 5% as recommendation, we did have a rather high intake of sugar. Now, what happens with the frontline labeled sweeteners? Well, we conducted several studies with children, young individuals, and pregnant women, and none of them showed excessive intake of LNCSs. It would go by 5% of the admissible intake. And when we had frontline labeling, which started in 2016, we've had it for the past for almost 10 years now. And what happened in Chile, there was a great reformulation of foods, as Susana pointed out, over 1,000 types of foodstuffs that were evaluated. And almost 100% of dairy-based products contain LNCSs, also for processed foods, and non-alcoholic beverages contain LNCSs as well. Especially, we're talking about normal sodas or yogurt-based products, which entail probably a higher intake of sugar. And it shows, the study shows that the numbers, however, have moved and the patterns have changed as well, especially in terms of sodium intake and particularly sugar, and it has decreased quite significantly. This type of consumption in children has gone down quite drastically, as we can see here, especially for salts or other types of or beverages and cereals. If a family were to maintain the same pattern of intake, and that is the same cereals, the same beverages, and what have you, they now have an intake that is way, way below what would have been 10 years ago. This data by Euromonitor in 2016 showed us that from being second place, we have reached 17th place, which is great for us. It's a significant reduction of sugary products in general, especially when we had things like dairy products and soda in our midst with so much sugar. To see these numbers drop has been great. And this it end up changing the life of children, this impact of that, and that is the case. Children were impacted and they continue, however, to maintain a lot of sweetener intake. That means, however, that the numbers have gone down with them because the the ADI has gone down with them as well. This is a study that was conducted by our nutrition agency here in Chile, and although in the abstract it shows that there were several numbers by about 5% of children that would go on over the ADI that was recommended. However, due to changes in the abstract in which we're showing that there were no real numbers that would tell us that there was an actual increase in the ADI for children. We also did conducted studies with pregnant women, and it shows pregnant individuals in the last column over here, and their ADI would not go over 10% of what is recommended, especially for things like stevia, which we in Chile, unfortunately, we did a bit of a miscalculation, but we have published new information that shows that these miscalculations have been corrected as well, and the ADI goes below 33% and with regard or with respect of the highest number of individuals that would be having larger intakes. This is another cohort that we did, a massive, rather massive cohort of individuals, and we also see that there's no ADI over what is recommended for, especially for pregnant individuals. We also evaluated chronic consumption or intake of sweeteners in several different regions of Chile. We used several protocols by the government agencies and we decided to create several models. We created four models, two that were conventional and two that were refined. And we found that the ADI in the four models does not go over the age groups that were extreme in terms of evaluation. The largest percentage of life expectancy was found in children with sucralose, and the largest number for intake was mostly sodas, yogurt, and other sugary beverages. So does that entail that this frontline labeling has improved the dietary habits of Chile? That is not the case. We are way below other countries like Paraguay or Uruguay. So the fact that you have these labels does not mean that you're going to eat more vegetables, more fruit. That means only that you're going to choose a little bit better if you want to choose better. If not, you can ignore the labels too. In Chile, we have the idea of having a sweetener seal or a label, and it has been already discussed on whether it is a good idea to have this particular label in any type of products. According to a small study that I'm going to skip because it is no longer relevant, but we ask, asked while frontline labeling was studying, and we used the idea of surveys, the central idea. We asked individuals if they were going to consume or take products that would have these labels. Well, according to the polls, about 80% of the individuals don't have no consideration of changing their habits regarding whether they would have the labels or not, whether these products would have the labels or not. So only 2% of the individuals polled said they would change their lifestyle, but the rest said they wouldn't. Amongst the many foodstuffs that we chose, uh, sugary beverages were the ones to shown the best performance in terms of change, however, because we hypothesized at the moment that we had the alternative of sugary beverages as something that would have changed. However, other types of foods would not be able to be changed. For instance, like say butter. It is very difficult to find a type of butter that you would like, regardless of whether it had the frontline labels or not. Well, by the way, this is what Susana showed, and these are the labels. So what is our position? Well, in Chile, over the past 10 years, we've worked quite importantly in sugar intake through the regulation, through the reformulations. If a family that has a normal intake of sugary beverages, and although they present a label, and then we have a non-sugary beverage that has no label, well, people are not going to go into further research for meta-analyses or scientific information for them. These types of seals or labels are equivalent. We know from investigations that somebody who picks soda is not going to pick water. So, regardless of whether they have a label or not, they're going to pick one or the other, whether they perform better or not. And if it is a flavor that they like, they're going to marry that flavor, right? So, regardless of whether a product might be artificial in nature or could be uh, synthetic even, they're going to drink it anyway, and they're going to buy it regardless of the label. So having a specific different label would mean that we would go back. In Mexico, I always ask if these labels have worked or not, and truly nobody knows. So that happens in Chile as well. So we're unfortunately going blind into this. And although it might seem as a quote unquote brilliant idea, in 10 years down the line, it is how we're going to know whether it worked or not. So in our conclusions, Chile did present a massive intake of ENCs, but we have seen that there's no improvement in how Chile's habits have worked in the past. Well, that's all for me. This is my contact information, and thank you. Thank you, Samuel. There was a lot of room for working here, especially in terms of how we restrained the intake of LNCS. We're going to go to the next talk. I'm going to introduce you to Paloma Valdéz. Paloma Almeda-Valdéz is a specialist in endocrinology and metabolism. She did her studies at the Technological Institute of Monterrey. She has a specialty in internal medicine at the Medical Sur Clinical Foundation and subspecialty in endocrinology by the National Institute of Nutrition and Medical Sciences, Salvador Subirán, where she also has a specialty in diabetes and metabolism. She has a postdoc in medical sciences by the Autonomous University of Mexico, and she has a postdoctoral studies stay at the Washington University in the United States. She is an adjunct specialist for the endocrinology department for the National Institute of Medical and Nutritional Sciences, Salvador Subirán, and member of the National System of Researchers in Mexico, Level 2, and the National Academy of Medicine of Mexico. Doctor, the floor is now yours. Hello there, and thank you very much for the invitation. I want to thank all the people that have joined us online as well. In the next few minutes, I'm going to present a little bit of the information regarding LNCS intake in Mexico. I have no conflict of interest, at least related to this presentation, as has happened in many other countries in Latin America, in our country as well. Corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, and LNCS's intake has increased at a greater rate compared to sugar itself. This is old data. Unfortunately, couldn't find the updated data, but in this period of time, which evaluated 2002 all the way to 2011, LNCS intake, as represented in red, grew by an annual rate of 10.7%, which represents an intake of over 2,000 tons every year in terms of consumption. Now, in its relative share in Mexican market, for LNCS in Mexico, as you can observe here, was by about 3.1%, at least in 2011, compared to sugar, which had a share of 70% in the market. Now, specific studies, some of them were conducted by our task force alongside Dr. Alonso Romo. We started this endeavor quite a while ago, and in this first study, we assessed the prevalence of LNCS intake in a selected population, that is, individuals suffering from diabetes in Mexico. At our institute, we decided to apply a frequency questionnaire, especially with available products at the market at the time, which has exponentially grown, especially the amount of products that we have with non-nutritional sweeteners. At the time, we had about 200 products that we managed to determine. And we also determined the prevalence of consumption or intake and how many variables of interest were correlated. You can see here the percentage of sweetener intake in individuals with diabetes. It is a very high percentage of intake, especially with the acesulfame-K, the combinations with aspartame or sucralose, and the different categories of products in which they were consumed, of course, but you can observe here mainly sugar substitutes in little packets were followed by beverages. The prevalence in this population was very high, which was 96%. Of all of these patients, intake was tended to be greater in men than women, especially with individuals suffering diabetes type 1 in contrast with diabetes type 2, a negative correlation between intake and age. That means that the older the individual, the less consumption, and there was also a correlation between glycosylated hemoglobin and education itself. Individuals who knew their levels would be less prone for the intake. And the intake was larger in those individuals that would not take the measures. And of course, it also has to do with availability in the market. This other study was published in 2020. It was a different task force, especially stemming from the health system in Mexico. These were individuals that were at the Internal Medicine Congress in 2016. We carried out or conducted a questionnaire with them on LNCS intake and general concepts on LNCSs. And you can see here that the percentages over here you show the total of physicians out of 500, out of 1,000 physicians, 500 of them were actually using these sweeteners. It's a little bit difficult to parse out the entirety of the information. 440, 494 of them, about 50% roughly, did not have any intake. And for students or residents of medicine, the prevalence was about 50% as well, for at least for the entire population that was asked. And Regarding knowledge in itself, 69% knew exactly what the definitions of LNCSs were. 65%, however, considered that they were not particularly clear on what LNCSs were, especially in relation to their natural or artificial origin. Another part mentioned the chemical composition. Regardless of being health professionals, you can see that about 62% of them didn't know about their chemical composition. 89% of the physicians did recognize that they would provide a non-caloric sweet taste, and 51% said at the time that it would alter the homeostasis of hemoglobin and glucose levels. We also did an online questionnaire, and although it is not a representative sample, it at least allowed us to achieve a large number of tests and questions that we could analyze properly. We evaluated the frequency of intake and the factors associated with said intake. Here we can see that divided in thirds or terciles, especially for LNCs, and you can see that practically all of the variables were completely different. I'll just give you a few. That these variables included income, weight. You can see how it increases in terms of LNCS intake as well. We also have the IBM and the BMI and the proportion of people that were sedentary or that would do no physical activities. We actually found a few statistically significant numbers here. We also measured physical activity and levels of physical activity. And an important aspect that we also assessed was the quality of diet index. And you can see how it was statistically significant, and it represented a little bit less of the proportion of less healthy for those that would have a large intake of the LNCs. That was the number, at least, that showed the most changes, and there was a largest proportion for individuals that had a healthier diet. So the variables that showed a positive association with intake, once again, we included income, BMI, smoking, physical activity, diet quality. We also had the presence of chronic diseases, that is, individuals suffering with diabetes, hypertension, and dyslipidemia. They tended to have a larger intake of LNCSs and also food consumption or intake. And age was also associated with negative frequency of LNCSs. The older the individual, the less they would consume them. That would include sugar as well. This is a more recent publication that was just released this year, in which we showed or what we wanted to describe were the patterns of intake. And here we identified the categories of products that were consumed in their larger proportions. We also wanted to know if there are subgroups of the population that are more prone to consume a few of the categories in these products. And of course, the study becomes more complicated because now we have even more products in the market that feature the LNCSs. We decided to divide them in different groups, eight groups of products that you can see here in the list. Packets, beverage, yogurt, jello, gums, water flavor, enhancers, desserts, candy, and cereals. And what you can see here in the different bars is the daily intake at least once a week, but not daily, and at least once a month, but not the entire week. And the last bar is never or very infrequently throughout the year. So, as you can observe here, of the category of products that feature LNCSs and the ones that would be consumed the most were the little packets by about 18% in prevalence. And light yogurt was the type of product that was consumed the most, at least once a week, but not daily, by about 16.7%. And for instance, water sweeteners were the categories that had the lowest frequency of intake by about 88.8% said that they would never use them, or at least once a year only. And the most frequently consumed category was sugar-free or light cereals by 1.3%, and desserts and candy was the category that was consumed by about a month by 28.8%, but not all weeks. So the opinion of the participants themselves regarding the likelihood of a short-term intake or stopping altogether, you can see truly that about 15% would continue to consume them for by about 7 days, and those that said definitely no went by 28%. The probability of no longer consuming them went by 29%, and probably yes went by 28%. He also pointed out that what we wanted to prove was that if we might have had subgroups in the consumption of the different categories. You can see here an illustration over here. Men are the individuals that consume more of the substitutes and the sweeteners and cereals. Individuals that have more studies tend to consume the packets the most, however, especially for beverages, yogurt, gum, and sweeteners in comparison to those individuals that were less educated, individuals over the age of 60 or suffering from chronic diseases and an income of over 15,000 pesos tend to consume more the packets, beverages, gums, and water sweeteners. So to conclude, sweeteners in Mexico, LNCSs in particular, have increased in their intake over the past few years. This has been pushed mostly due to their availability in the market. These products have become now more handy. They're now more available. So we've recently incorporated the use of the seals or labels, which is not a warning in itself, according to government standards. It is a non-regulatory type of measure. It is actually rectangular. It has a different shape compared to the regular labels. And we are still pondering on whether we need to even tax it further. However, it will happen eventually, and all LNCSs will be taxed as much as sugary beverages are now taxed. And although Mexico has a high availability of processed foods that have LNCSs, but the real consumption compared with many other countries tends to be on the lower side. There's a lot of variability in consumption that is mostly influenced by age, education, socioeconomic level, and presence of chronic diseases too. The evidence points out that most of adults in Mexico consume LNCSs, even in smaller quantities. So total exposure tends to be on the lower end too. If we see that at a global level, that is. But it is important to understand patterns, factors, implications for the public health system. In order to push strategies that would regulate, we need to create education strategies and research strategies that will allow us to guarantee the adequate and safe use of these chemical components. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, doctora. Siguiendo un poco con el programa,
Thank you very much. To continue with today's program, we will introduce Dr. Adriana Pavesi. She will be talking about intake or low intake of calories in Brazil.
Ella es profesora asociada en la Universidad de
She's associate professor of the Campinas and toxic elements, and she has research about nutrients, toxic metals, additives, and veterinary elements with the analysis of Florence research and mitigation labels in the human consumption of chemicals through the diet. She has published over 80 papers that have been peer-reviewed and scientific group review. Just of the Surveillance National Agency, Anvisa, from Brazil, the work group in Inocuity of ILSI, Brazil, and the mixed committee of FAO and WHO about food experts in the food registry of 2023 to 2027. The doctor will not be here present, but if you need translation, you can do it with the different options that we have.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be at the first Latin American Scientific Forum on low, no-calorie sweeteners, talking about exposure assessment to sweeteners in Brazil. We would like to start this presentation with a short introduction about the regulatory situation of sweeteners in Brazil. These food additives are regulated by Anvisa, which is the National Health Regulatory Authority, and are defined as a substance other than sugars that imparts a sweet taste to food. Currently, 27 sweeteners are authorized for use as food additives in the country, in 7 food categories, including dietary supplements, foods and beverages for weight management, controlled sugar intake, and sugar-restricted diets. Among the sweeteners authorized for use in Brazil are those considered nutritive, such as polyols, with a lower sweetness intensity compared to sucrose, and those considered non-nutritive with low or no calories, or with a higher sweetness intensity compared to sucrose, such as aspartame, sucralose, stevia glycosides, and thaumatin. Each sweetener has specific maximum permitted levels depending on the food category, and all of them have been evaluated for safety through toxicological assessment. Another point that I would like to show is the distribution of sweeteners in food sold in Brazil. This study, for example, evaluated 3,300 labels of foods available in the local market in relation to the declaration of food additives. The authors identified the presence of 16 substances used as sweeteners in 453 products, which corresponded to 14% of the total database. As can we see in the table, a large part of the use of sweeteners is related to 5 substances: acesulfame, potassium, sucralose, aspartame, cyclamate, and saccharin. In another study conducted in 2021 involving almost 2,000 food labels containing low no-calorie sweeteners, we observed a similar distribution trend regarding the use of acesulfame, potassium, sucralose, aspartame, cyclamate, and saccharin, with a more evident appearance of stevia glycosides, especially in baked sweets and plant-based beverages. According to the authors, most samples presented a single sweetener in the formulation, but combinations of up to 5 substances were observed. This is also a recent study of commercial food labels, but it investigated the presence of food additives in approximately 1,000 labels of infant foods. The authors identified the presence of 12 sweeteners in 96 products, which corresponded to 8.6% of the database, with sucralose, again, being the most frequent one, present in 48 labels. In addition to understand the distribution of sweeteners and their use as food additives, it's essential to assess population exposure. That is, the amount of these substances that the population is ingesting through food consumption, especially those sweeteners that have a numerical acceptable daily intake, or ADI. The ADI is defined as the amount of a food additive that can be ingested every day throughout an individual's life without appreciable risk to health, and is established by expert scientific committees such as JECFA, which is a joint FAO and WTO committee. If human intake is below the ADI, exposure to a given food additive is considered safe. Therefore, assessing the population's exposure to sweeteners through the diet is an essential step in establishing safe dietary standards. Exposure assessment should consider different types of information, such as the distribution of sweeteners in local foods, include, whenever possible, levels of use reported by industries or analytical data on food concentrations, as well as local regulation and local dietary habits. Include food consumption data from the general population and vulnerable subgroups. Regarding exposure studies in the Brazilian general population, we have some published research that used the 2008-2009 Household Budget Survey, which is known as POF, and means Pesquisa de Orçamentos Familiares in Portuguese, as a source of food consumption data. This is a nationally representative survey that collected information from over 30,000 individuals aged 10 years or older. Different strategies were used in these studies to define the exposure scenarios. In this first study, for example, intake was estimated for 6 low no-calorie sweeteners under brand loyalty and general population, consider sweetener use levels reported by industries. According to the authors, even in the extremely unlikely scenario, considering the consumers-only population exposed at the maximum reported sweetener concentrations, or scenario A, the total intake of the substances remained below the respective ADI, both at the mean and the upper percentiles of intake. In the second study, also using POF 2008-2009, a substitution method was adopted in which 50% of added sugar was replaced by low no-calorie sweeteners based on sweetness equivalence. The authors observed that intakes would be below the JECFA ADI for 5 of the 6 substances in all examined population groups, both for average and high consumers. For cyclamate, exceedance of the ADI was determined for all age groups amongst the high consumers in one of the two considered models, while estimated the intakes in the other model were below or reached the ADI. In this study, the authors used the data on food consumption from the most recent POF conducted from 2017 to 2018 with more than 46,000 individuals aged 10 years or and older. This data was combined with permitted levels of low-no-calorie sweeteners according to local regulation to estimate exposure to 8 substances. The occurrence of sweeteners was evaluated through label information of commercial products available in the Brazilian market. The authors observed that the estimated intake for average consumers was below the ADI and does not suggest a toxicological concern. A similar scenario was observed for high consumers, except for sodium cyclamate and stevia glycosides, with intakes corresponded to 144% and 131% of their respective ADIs in the general population. Also based on national consumption data from the POF 2017-2018, some authors investigated the intake of low-no-calorie sweeteners by the self-declared diabetic population using permitted levels of sweeteners in Brazil or their concentration reported in the labels, as in the case of beverages. The results showed that the estimated intake for the diabetic population was below the ADI in all evaluated scenarios. The highest exposure were observed for sodium cyclamate, stevia glycosides, and sucralose. The intake of sweeteners by pregnant women was also investigated in Brazil, using food consumption data from 305 participants, collected through 24-hour recall. The distribution of 15 sweeteners in commercial foods was also evaluated by label information, but exposure was estimated for 7 low-no-calorie sweeteners, considering their permitted levels in Brazil or concentration reported in the labels. The authors observed that all exposures at mean and high percentiles remained well below the ADIs. This is the last study I would like to present. It was published very recently and deals with the exposure to low-no-calorie sweeteners of Brazilian children aged 1 to 3 years. The authors used individual food consumption data obtained through 24-hour recalls from 92 participants and analytical concentrations of 8 sweeteners in more than 250 samples to estimate exposure for the general population, consumers only, and brand loyalty consumers. As observed here, even in the most conservative scenario, which refers to brand loyalty consumers, exposure did not exceed the ADI for any sweetener, suggesting no toxicological concern in this population subgroup. In the case of sodium cyclamate, the exposure at percentile 95 of this population was below 90% of the ADI, being the sweetener that most approached the safety parameter. In conclusion, the current body of evidence indicates that despite their methodological differences, the available studies converge on key findings, showing that low-no-calorie sweeteners, as used in Brazil today, do not pose a population-level health toxicological risk. Cyclamate consistently appears as the sweetener closest to the ADI. Regulatory agents should maintain attention to periodic updating of concentration databases and continued exposure monitoring, since food dietary habits and patterns of sweeteners use may change over time. Here are the references used in this presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Brazil. A los ponentes que están presentes aquí los invitamos a pasar al estrado.
The speakers that are present, please come up to the stage since we will have our Q&A. Adriana, could you please stay online to be able to participate in our discussion?
Hello, Dr. Pavesi, are you online? Can you open your camera and microphone, please?
Yes, I'm online. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My camera is
already. We cannot see you right now. Let me check with the.
My camera is already open.
Okay, we can see you now. We can see you now. Thank you very much.
Pues bueno, adelante si en el público tenemos.
Okay, very good. If we have any questions from our audience.
A la doctora Georgina.
So, Dr. Georgina, here in Mexico, we have the idea that the sweetened beverage consumption might be more frequent in lower socioeconomic levels. And I see that this is not true, and I'm surprised by it. I imagine there might be some differences, but maybe this is only a perception that has no backup. I would like to ask, what percentage of the daily ingestion are represented by the industrialized beverage like sodas? Total. Well, we are not talking only about carbonated soda, but also commercial sodas or beverages like juices or teas. Only sodas were 28-point-something%. Of the total calorie intake. And if here we add some other commercial beverages like teas, or flavored beverages or juices, it gets to very high percentages, over 30% of the total calorie ingestion. And in total, calories represent over 75%.
Bueno, para la doctora Socolovsky.
For Dr. Socolovsky, we were talking about ultra-processed foods, and I would like to ask if there is a specific definition about ultra-processed foods. Thank you for the question. There is no definition. First of all, we need to take into account that the EFSA classification is not accepted about any regulatory agency worldwide. It does not appear in FDA or Codex. FDA recently asked for information to be able to create a definition because the authors of NOVA created a long list of substances defined as substances that have a high level of sugar, fat, and sodium, that have a marker where they have a food additive or presence of a substance or ingredient that is not regularly used in the kitchen. This has no scientific backup because housewives or cooks do not use industrial ingredients like maltodextrin or vegetable proteins, etc. This is not available for regular people who cook, and we need to acknowledge that this is a very important stage because the WHO has made a call for experts to get together to study and to determine if they need to create some guidelines for these food elements that are still not defined.
Ok. La pregunta iba específicamente porque en la última reunión
Very
de la
good, thank
CAC,
you. The last meeting of CAC at Codex,
participantes
one of the
pidieron
participants
que se empiece el estudio de la definición de
asked
ultraprocesados.
to begin working on the definition of ultra-processed foods. That's why I asked that question. Thank you. Thank you for making this clear. The person who raised the question to Codex was Dr. Sangoifred, president of the International Union of Science and Technology, and I'm part of it because we have a work group together that has come up with a proposal to classify foods, and this includes items that have to do with the composition of food, the nutritional composition of food, how this can be affected, derived from higher temperatures that might decrease or increase the bioavailability of vitamins, or to modify the composition. And this work group has decided to bring a proposal to Codex for this classification because this has generated many adverse situations related to industrialized food items because they are defined by the Codex that also signals the quantity and the number of additives that might be used in certain food items. So Codex was the right environment to be able to solve this issue that has generated a lot of confusion, not only in regulatory entities of countries like Latin America, but also in the general population. Thank you. Dr. Eki?
Thank you for the presentations. The warning labels against sugar, excess salt, excess fat, excess calories, and also non-caloric sweeteners, they are in place in various countries in Latin America now for quite some years. Are there any data on their effect on consumer behavior or public health issues, or is that part of government policies to look at the effects of that? Or, yeah, just a very basic question, I suppose.
Thank you for the question, Dr. de Grasse. Currently, there is no, I would say, we cannot say that any country has effective data to compare what has been done prior to the regulations and after the regulations. We do not have consumption data, but we do have a report by UNICEF published in 2022 that reports that of all the countries in Latin America, Chile is the most obese country, and children under age 5 are also the ones that have indicated the largest weight. So as you can see, since the regulations were imposed in June of 2016 in Chile, we can see, according to the UNICEF report, that nothing has changed, because there is an explanation for this,
and should be taken into consideration. The fact that in the Latin American countries, not more than 28-30% of total calories consumed come from packaged products. So 70% of more of the diet comes from, meals eaten at home, in restaurants, in school. So actually if you take into account the fact that people consume a lot of home cooked meals, and there's no education, because actually in Chile, there has not been an education campaign regarding nutrition, and nutrition is very seldom taught in schools. So people continue eating all the high fat and fried foods that are typical of Chilean cuisine, also in Mexican cuisine. So, it is too much to request to legislation that only covers 20, 25, 28% of foods that are eaten, calories eaten from, it is a request too big to ask such a regulation to have a performance that changes behavior. So thank you for the question.
A mí me gustaría añadir un comentario y hacer un par de preguntas.
I would like to ask a question and a couple of comments according to the ultra-processed definition. Even when this definition has had a great impact globally and internationally, and there are many association studies to determine health effects on the consumption of these ultra-processed foods according to the classification that Susana mentioned. My opinion, and I want to make it clear, is that this is quite unfortunate, because this classification is not based on the actual processes. It's a mix of considerations, of processes, but in a great measure, this is not about processes. This is a classification of use of additives in food, but also sometimes of nutrient additives. And I want to set an example. For example, milk. Our mothers used to make milk and they heat it. But today we have pasteurization, and these are 72 degrees 15 seconds, and this has it has less effect than what our mothers used to do. It diminishes the quality of product that we used to consume. But a product UHT like milk is ultra heat treatment. Of course, it's ultra heat, but it is 150 degrees for 2.4 seconds. If you make a close observation of scientific publications, it has less nutrients than what our mothers or grandparents used to do. So, this classification does not take into account the processes compared to the effect that they have in the products. They are not taking this into account. Of course, you can use an additive, but this is to avoid maybe a separation in different phases, or you might use phospholipid, which is something that we consume regularly in all of our food. So this is a personal opinion. I'm not the first person to say that the classification, the NOVA classification, is not valid. It doesn't matter how many research it has around. It is not valid. And to me, this is a great opportunity for international institutions like Codex really have an idea that have a classification based on processes, that it contains more or less additives. However, You cannot have a mix. If we have associations, we can find associations of people who are blonde with anything else, and if they ingest more or less sugar. And it might be true, but however, many of these correlations on health or diet consumptions, but this is not based on the classification that really works. So I believe that NOVA, we need to say it loud and clear. This is generating tensions. It is generated a lack of knowledge for the population. So I would like to hear about this. From what I know about Mexico, there are many people, or maybe this is not true anymore, but there are many people that take sugar added beverages that are not industrial. And what is the state doing for this? Or are there any policies so that even in small towns under 1,000 people, they have safe water and that they motivate the consumption of water, drinking water?
No que yo sepa alguna política, digo.
I don't know if there is a specific policy for motivating or for avoiding this kind of sugar added flavored waters.
Simplemente pues la recomendación de no consuman azúcar en general es lo que se ha.
Just what they motivate is to avoid sugar in general and to have drinking water available at schools, that they have more water fountains, at buildings, that there is wide availability of drinking water. I would like to add something else. As Samuel was saying, the consumption of sugar is harmful if it's an excess, but in countries like Costa Rica, we are fortifying sugar with vitamin A. And if we decrease the consumption of sugar, we will also decrease the vitamin A that we are adding and that we are bringing to the population. I would only like to add something to what Dr. Hill was mentioning. The ultra-processed definition, just like Carlos Monteiro confessed a couple of years ago in a meeting in Sao Paulo about diabetes, this is a concept that he came up with. He had a sociological idea. Why did we come from eating some feijão, beans, to consume packaged foods? So he generated this classification that obviously is incorrect because it does not respond to the processing of food as he indicated in the beginning of his publications. Because he started learning, he realized that he was wrong, and he created a story that's saying that additives that he calls cosmetics, which is another concept that is forbidden because you cannot hide the harm of an additive, and it has minimum processed foods like coffee or cocoa, and we know that they are not minimum processed. They suffer several processes to be able to convert the fruit in something that can become an infusion, either cocoa or coffee. And other foods have processes that are very simple, but they are still called ultra-processed foods, like yogurt. A traditional fermentation is considered ultra-processed if it contains a sweetener. So this classification is incorrect. That is clear, but it has been widely accepted by the general community, and this has been fired by the media as well. So today we need to talk about this from the scientific point of view and ask so that this confusion ends. Thank you, Susana. Now we have Dr. Adriana, who would like to build up on this. Go ahead, doctor.
Hi, hello.
Hola.
First of all, I apologize for not being with you. So I would like to complement with some information from Brazil. I would like to say that this terminology, ultra-processed food, I agree with the opinions of the colleagues, okay? And I would like to say that this terminology, ultra-processed food, is really disseminated here in Brazil. And communication is a little bit difficult to make people understand that there are more things in this kind of terminology that food additives, salt, and sugar. So what I think that is really important is to include in the discussion groups at the institutions, international institutions, and other bodies, include professionals from the field of food science and technology, include more food engineers that can discuss about processing and not only the nutrition aspects of foods. For example, if you take coffee as an example, this classification does not consider some other food safety aspects. For example, contaminants. If you take coffee as an example, coffee has several processing steps, and you have the formation of toxic compounds during these steps, like acrylamide, like furan, and this is not taken into account. It's an important food safety aspect that should be discussed in the working groups about novel and ultra-processed foods. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Quería agregar también que muchas veces
I wanted to add that the studies in ultra-processed food, the calculations I made based on calories, and calories don't really matter, but to be able to calculate the effect of ultra-processed foods, we take into account total calorie amounts, and we find associations with obesity, with chronic diseases, but these are mainly for added beverages. So we have an effect on this, and they are within the group where we have yogurt, diet beverages, which are sometimes separated and added to the sugar beverages. And we know that the metabolic effect is completely different. They group them and they look at them they were sisters, so the results generate a lot of contradiction. We have published paper that is called ultra-processed, and there are some associations in these, and there are some others that do not add any associations, and this is where I generate. This is not so black and white. And when we talk about nutrition, it is a scale of gray, and this is what happens here as well. Alonso. Hi, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to listen to you all. I have a question mainly for Dr. Susana and Dr. Samuel, because you mentioned this, but any of you might build up on this. According to the label that it says it contains sweeteners, not advisable for kids, I know that this is not based on evidence, because there are only a few studies of metabolic effects in children, especially in the association with food. But this has been replicated in several countries of Latin America. We have this label that started here in Mexico. So what the Health Ministry did to be able to add this label is not to not to provide any incentive for beverages with a sweet flavor. And something that has happened with the front labeling in Mexico is that some products avoid labels excess sugar now add sweeteners, especially in Mexico. Regular soda, the most famous brand, includes regular sugar plus sucralose. So I would like to know your opinion regarding to this. Maybe there is no research behind it, but do you really think that this label has no benefit to be able to prevent promotion of sweet flavors? Thank you so much for this question. First and foremost, we need to remember, as Rebecca was saying, that food additives are assessed by JECFA and are added to the guidelines. They are all it for what the codex mentions the general population that is from 0 to 104 years old. So they are safe. Grandma or a 2-year-old. So regarding to this, there is no question because international agencies have assessed this already. Now let's go to nutrition. Of course, there is no recommendation for kids to have low calorie food. It's not from nutrition. Pediatricians should recommend that are cooked by the mother or the caretaker based on fruits, vegetables, grains, and for portions so that the kid learns how to chew and everything that pediatricians recommend. There is no guideline that needs to say not for kids, because this is incorrect. There is a subgroup of about 10% of children who live with diabetes and they need to ingest sweet food, because if not, they will not be able to have it. The best confused are the 10% of the population and the parents of these kids who live with diabetes.
Adicionando un poco el tema de la reformulación.
When we talk about the reformulation, we do know that in Mexico and many countries of Latin America, excessive consumption of added sugars is an issue. According to the labeling system that we have today, reformulating a beverage to avoid labels is almost impossible. So this effort to add a sweetener to try to avoid a label, this is an effort to try to reduce added sugars because it is impossible to get away with the label. But this is confusing because you have excess sugar and also you have sweeteners. But what has happened with many products in the industry is that products that are designed and directed for the general population, the full family, companies have a label that says no recommendation for kids, that this generates a problem in the market. So they have reformulated to bring the added sugars. I have a question for institutions, official institutions, if they have followed up the added sugar ingestion after the label about sweeteners, because when we know from the reformulation that there are many products that took away sweeteners and came back to sugar because they prefer the excess sugar label, because the excess sugar adds up on calories and it avoids other labels like excess fat. This is a very complex question because you might think that it may be a good idea to add the sweetener label because maybe a small kid will say, well, they don't need to ingest this. In Latin America, we have a high prevalence of obesity, children obesity, excessive consumption of sugar. We have a bad quality in diets and different associated issues to this. So what is better? a little bit of a sweetener or a lot of sugar? And that's the question. And this is very hard to answer. If we had a low sugar diet, it would be easy to decide. But very good, Dr. Segundo. Good afternoon. I wanted to remind you of the NOVA classification originally was created by Dr. Monteiro is related to it's directly related to the calorie number. The ultra process was a classification that related to the rest of groups with a lot of calories and affected obesity. We would need to remove from this classification some foods like sweeteners. That is what would need to be done. Technical review to be able to define what ultra-processed foods are and if they have a relationship with number of calories. My second remark is as part of the scientific community, we need to take into account peppers, right now I have had up to 4 categories, like non-nutritive sweeteners, non-calorie sweeteners, no sugar sweeteners, low calorie or no calorie sweeteners. So these terms confuse the scientific community and even worse for the local community. So we need to agree on one term that allows to unify all publications that are available and related to this. Thank you for the question. I'm from the regulatory side, and this suggestion is really interesting to me. When we talk about non-nutritious, caloric sweeteners comes from the scientific literature. There is in any country there isn't any specific one, but they all describe what we want to describe. Therefore, this would continue to be this way. I doubt that any regulatory agency decides that only one denomination describes these kind of substances that are synthetic or that come from natural origin that allow to substitute the sweet flavor by partially or totally replacing sugar. So I think we will continue with this because it has happened even when saccharin came up in the 1800s, and today there is no issue related to health about sweeteners. I prefer to call them non-calorie sweeteners because non-nutritious does not apply to all of them. For example, aspartame doesn't apply to these because aspartame has 4 calories per gram, but since we use it in a milligram quantity, the calories do not modify any of this. And when we talk that the appreciation of ultra-processed food includes also high-calorie food elements isn't true. First and foremost, because the categorization is mistaken. Nova 1, Nova 2, Nova 3, and Nova 4. Nova 3 includes fish, food that are in syrup, high sugar, high fat foods, and category 4 includes breads, yogurts with non-sweeteners. They are not high calorie and they are quite healthy. However, there is no way to find the NOVA categorization because it is mistaken from the beginning to the end. We need to delete it of our vocabulary. And the research related to health issues, when we talk about the ultra-processed foods, they are all association. They do not demonstrate any causality. The only piece of research that demonstrated causality is the one from Kevin Hall. And today, research shows that you can have a perfectly healthy diet by consuming this ultra-processed food, even if you get them in the supermarket in Denmark. It's a study called Structure that shows what effectively modifies the speed of consumption and the number of calories needed per minute is the structure of this food. All the foods that are called ultra-processed rated. It was published 2 months ago. Shows the characteristic, the structure of the food that make that you eat faster and slower. And this decreases the consumption of calories. This is only my opinion. Thank you. Of course, there is a lot of discussion and different consultations, and this makes our conversation very dynamic. To wrap up, Dr. Mónica Hurtado would like to ask a question. Just to build up on what Susana was saying, some guidelines in the UK have shown, we have compared several food items with the NOVA classification that might come within dietary guidelines. So when we talk about education, nutrition, and health, is what needs to lead. Sometimes having the thought that we at home we cannot control temperature, and it would be even worse than having a packaged food that the heat was controlled. And when we talked about the sweeteners in Mexico from the Diabetes Association and the 22 associations that are affiliated in the country, we saw this, it was still confusion because year after year we educate moms that today have a diabetes type 1 as how they can include food based on dietary and international guidelines where we said safe is safe. This is the education that we provide. When we saw this label, it's going back and begin all over again. Is it safe? Is a metabolism? What's the expression of this today? Moms will say, and they can send their kids to a camp and they can ingest a sweetener, and that's a population that we have 1-to-1 just the rest of the population are confused. And what we need to guidelines and to be able to provide education for the population. That's what will help the most. Today we know that safe is safe, that we can include everything and that everything falls into moderation. Costa Rica, you ingest sugar and that is safe as well. You consume sweeteners that are also safe. You cannot say switch from one to another because it will switch to an excess sugar. An excess of sweeteners will not happen because we get saturated. But with sugar, we could get to an excess point. So my indication about not getting confused, today we have been very clear. Safe is safe, and for each food population, there is a specific quantity, distribution, and the orientation and the education that we can provide. Thank you very much. To wrap up our first stage, we would like to thank you for being here, and we'll be back within an hour back to this forum. Thank you.